The very first Manitoba Podcast Festival goes down International Podcast Day, Sunday, September 30th, 12 to 4 p.m. at the Park Theatre. Manitoba's podcast community gathers for an afternoon of networking, education, and so much more, featuring local podcast hosts, producers, radio personalities, taking part in panel discussions and Q&As. Take part in this fantastic networking opportunity. You can like us on Facebook at Manitoba Podcast Festival. Tickets are just $5. The very first Manitoba Podcast Festival, Sunday, September 30th at the Park Theatre.
You're listening to Garbage Hill, Winnipeg's first podcast network.
Hello, welcome everybody to Creative Manitoba. Thanks for coming to Podcast for Artists, First Friday's panel, presented in partnership with the Manitoba Podcast Festival. And if you don't know, it's a new festival organized by a lot of our panelists here actually, and it's September 30th at the Park Theatre, so be sure to check that out. A couple announcements before we begin. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land in which we gather is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Innu, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I don't know if you've noticed, but we have a camera here. We're live streaming on Facebook right now, so don't worry, only the panelists are in view. But if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you, or you can ask it and then we'll just repeat the question so that the viewers know what you asked. And then for those who are online, ask questions in the comments and we'll try to get to them at the end of the panel. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic, or nope, he has his own mic. Our moderator today is Sam Thompson from Witchpolice Radio, and I'll let everybody introduce themselves. Thank you.
Cool. Well, is this, am I on? Yeah? You guys can hear me? Cool. Yeah, thanks for coming. This is awesome. I've done some live podcasts before, but the turnout is usually pretty dismal, so this is nice to see that people are actually here. For people who don't know who I am, I host a podcast called Witchpolice Radio. It's a weekly, twice a week podcast where I interview local musicians. I've been doing it for about 6 years now, and I've talked to 300 and some local artists from all different genres of music. And so the topic of the conversation today with all of the panelists here, I have my own opinions on it because I've spoken to so many artists doing my own show, but each one of these people here has a very different type of show that they work on. So I think we can get some pretty cool just attitudes and opinions towards how podcasting can help benefit artists. So I think we should just go down the table here, or the line of chairs, and if everyone can introduce themselves and say a little bit about what their show is about and what they do, we'll get started.
Hello. Hey.
You are way louder than me.
Whoa. Somebody turn Sam up. Turn Sam up in the headphones. My name is Stephen Richard. Hello. How are you? Good. How are you? Great. Hey. My name is Stephen Richard. I host the Ever Sick podcast. I also host the Digital Drum podcast for APTN, and I'm also the afternoon host on NCI FM, which is 105.5 in Winnipeg and across the province.
Hi, my name's Stephanie Cram, and I work for CBC for the radio show Unreserved, but it also has a podcasting component. That show is focused on Indigenous culture, community, and conversation. We've been on the air for, I think this is the 5th year now, hosted by Rosanna Deerchild. So yeah, that's me.
And I'm Cameron Kinnereth, and I guess I host Gay Lunch Podcast. No, I know I host. I know I host Gay Lunch Podcast. And we talk to marginalized communities within the gay community in Winnipeg. And I get the chance to travel quite a bit and talk to people in different cities. And I also host queer comedy at Club 200. And yeah, that's me.
I'm Madeline Bird, and I am the host and co-producer of the So Unexpected podcast. We just actually launched our 4th season on Wednesday. And So Unexpected is a raw and edgy interview series We talk about everything from sex, relationships, politics, all the good stuff that makes us human. I'm also a radio host for NCI with Stefan over here. I host Friends on Friday, where I'm supposed to be today, but I'm here with y'all. And I also host the Indigenous Music Countdown. I write and host for the Indigenous Music Countdown. It's one I love IMC. I really, really love IMC. I love getting to know all the artists. I had no idea that there was such amazing Indigenous talent until I started this show. So that's me.
Cool. Well, now I got volume. This is a little better. So yeah, like I said, there's obviously a pretty diverse range of shows that people work on here. So I think we can get some interesting viewpoints. And I guess there's also sort of two elements of what we're talking about today. The first being how podcasting can help creative people and artists sort of further their own goals in terms of starting their own podcast or and things like that, and also how artists can use being a guest on a podcast as a way to sort of further their own careers and use it to open new doors and new opportunities. So on the first point, I think because he's sitting next to me, I'm going to start with Stefan. And you are someone who started basically a basement podcast where you were interviewing your friends, interviewing interesting people, and you sort of turned that into a radio career. You're an actual radio voice now, right? So, I mean, how did you go from one basement podcaster interviewing friends about wrestling or whatever to this? I mean, what was the kind of procedure to get to that point?
So I started the Ever Sick podcast, which is my podcast. Ever Sick is kind of like a slang term in the Indigenous community, just like ever sick, calm down. So and I wanted to have like a really unique take on presenting Indigenous stories and Indigenous people, and I wanted to celebrate the successes of our own people in our own community. And it's not Indigenous exclusive, but that was, I guess, because if I'm on it, I'm from the Saugeen First Nation. I guess that makes every episode Indigenous. So when I started doing these podcasts with a number of different guests, like wrestlers, I used to be a pro wrestler for 13 years. And then once I got out of wrestling and I had no creative outlet, and I got into this, and like I mentioned, doing the Indigenous focus stuff, it started getting around the community to different people in different places, and then eventually people started reaching out and saying, hey, I really like your podcast. Hey, can I be on your podcast? And then I chose to interview the people at Digital Drum, which is the APTN's online music service. And when I interviewed them about what they do and who they profile, they said, hey, could you do our podcast? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I didn't think anything of it. I thought like, hey, maybe I'll interview like one or two people and try it out and see how it goes. And then they came out with me with a money figure, and I was like, yeah, I'll do that. And then it grew from there, and then eventually from that, and Digital Drum has a national reach because it's on a national television network, or it's tied to a national television network, that when the first season was over, had a lot more exposure, and I just kind of dominoed from there. And then eventually I got on at NCI. It was originally supposed to be a 4-day tryout kind of thing. It was like, hey, can you fill in for 4 days? And then it's like, well, come back next week. Come back next week. And then now here I am 5 months later.
Right on. That's awesome. I think that kind of is maybe a question for everyone here, is that I think a lot of people have the idea when they start a podcast that they see examples of people who have succeeded, and a lot of the time it's a celebrity or something who have a podcast and they'll have millions of listeners right away, and they try it for 3 episodes and they get 2 listeners, and then they just scrap the idea. So I think that you're a good example of someone who has actually turned podcasting into a career in a roundabout way. I mean, it sounds like you kind of were fortunate enough to the right place at the right time in a few cases, but it's cool to see that, because I think there's definitely a preconceived notion that podcasting is not going to make you any money and not going to actually get you anything other than talking to your friends in your basement, right? Yeah. So I guess for the rest of you, do you think that podcasting at this point in time, now that it's become more of a thing that people know about, do you think it's a viable way, a career option for people who want to start their own shows? For anyone here, I mean.
Absolutely. It's opened lots of doors for me, not just in radio. I've had the opportunity to be featured on Huffington Post like a tourist. So lots of very interesting opportunities have manifested out of this. And I'm like Stefan. We started in the Coach B studios, Roger's basement. And yeah, it's really about being consistent. I think consistency is huge. And, you know, a lot of people say to me, oh, how did you get this person on? How did you get that person on? You just ask. And if people see that you take this serious and you love what you do, they will take time out for you.
For sure, yeah. That's a good point too. I think that a lot of people, kind of on the same line of what I was saying before, they see all these celebrities with podcasts and they see them all having celebrity guests and think, well, I can't do this because I don't know, you know, this famous person. I have my friend who, you know, is a wrestler or whatever, you know, and they think no one's going to listen to this. But yeah, I think that is a good point, that you just need to sort of ask, and most of the time someone's happy to hear what you have to say and share their story. I think that wasn't really a question, but so I guess, I mean, we'll go over here too. I mean, you being with CBC, your role is a little bit different than the rest of us here, who are a little more DIY as far as podcasting is concerned. But how has podcasting sort of been received at CBC? Because I've noticed a lot of more CBC shows being available in podcast form. Is it something that's kind of embraced there, or?
Yeah, it feels like there's a slow movement towards podcasting at this point. They're almost like a bit of catching up, I'd say. I'm a huge podcast fan, and I have been for years and years and years, and it just seems like now there is more of a focus on it. And it's figuring out how we can make podcasting something separate, especially in our show right now. Our podcast is only slightly different. We take the songs out because we don't have license to do that, and then just pop it up. So there is an interest in trying to make it something unique and include content that maybe people don't hear on the radio. But again, it takes time, and we're kind of just scrambling to try and figure out how to make it something different. But there is definitely more of a focus right now in CBC, and they do want to train more people and get them working in podcasting as much as possible, it seems. So, okay.
Do you think there's a wide understanding among listeners of the difference between radio and podcasting?
Perhaps. I think that there's a lot of confusion about what podcasting is, because
sure.
I know we've even released videos of explaining how to download a podcast onto a phone, because a lot of our listeners are in an older demographic, so a lot of them don't know how to even access this material. So I think it's a big learning curve, unfortunately, for a lot of our audience, but hopefully we'll get there and they'll be more and more interested in the podcasts. And a lot of the times the podcasts do end up on radio in some capacity. So that's promising that we're not missing out on that demographic.
Yeah, there's a bit of a back and forth with a lot of shows, I think. I mean, my show airs on UMFM as well as being primarily a podcast. And I think there's a lot of people doing things like that, where they will either do a show for, whether it's a campus radio station or a more professional radio station, and then it will also be released in podcast form or vice versa. So it's cool to see CBC embracing that too, because there's a lot of shows that I listen to on CBC radio that now I can listen to whenever, right? Which is kind of nice. So. Yeah, that's cool. And obviously one more person we haven't talked to yet. Sorry to leave you last, but
I mean, no, like my reach has been I started off in the basement too, talking to friends and this and that. But because I guess I use Google AdWords and I put in the words gay Muslim, now my reach is global. Oh, cool. Like I see people listening from Bangladesh and from the Ukraine and from Sri Lanka, and I guess something's going on in Singapore where like people are talking about it and they're getting on there. And my reach has been pretty good so far. Locally and globally is like half and half. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and like the opportunities that are coming my way, like I'm getting speaking engagements. I think I'm a comedian, so so I've been getting some, because I have a podcast, I have a platform, comedians come onto here. I got a couple of RuPaul's Drag Race girls onto my show too. Cool. So, it's just like she said, when you want to ask, you ask, and then the opportunities come to you.
That's interesting too, the global versus local thing, because I think it's also easy to think that especially if you're talking to local people on your show, that you're assuming that the audience is just going to be, within Winnipeg or within a specific community in Winnipeg. I mean, I think all of our shows here sort of focus on kind of niche elements of the city and of the wider world. And I think it's very easy to think, oh, it's just going to be these guys down the street checking out my show. But yeah, the fact that you can put it online and it's open to anyone, that's a huge step for guests on your podcast too, because they're exposed to a much larger audience than they might think just going into your basement and talking to you, right? So Yeah, it's very cool to see those kind of stats happening and realizing that people are outside of your backyard are listening to your show. So this is maybe a question for anyone on the panel. As far as actually booking guests on your show, I mean, I know Adeline, you said that you basically just ask and they'll either come on or not. But what do you look for, I guess, in a podcast guest? Because I think a lot of people would love to be on a podcast, but they don't necessarily know, should they be reaching out to you? How do they do that? How do they get noticed, I guess, by and depending what they do, it could be any one of these podcasts or any other. But is there something you look for as hosts or producers in a guest that will kind of make them stand out?
Well, I usually plan my podcast, my seasons beforehand, before I launch the season. Usually, I kind of pick my guests based on my life experiences. So, like this week, I interviewed all my classmates that I went to film school with at NSI. And so I'm kind of telling stories my life through my guests, I guess you can say. So anything that I'm sort of enlightened by. So if I'm like really excited about food one week, I'll do something about food. Or if I meet last season, I got to meet Reese Malone, who's a sex therapist. And the moment I met him, I was like, I need to have you on my podcast. Like sometimes I just feel inspired in that moment. And then other times I plan things out. But for me, it really depends. If I meet somebody who I find just super interesting, I'm like, hey, come on my podcast. Here's what we're going to talk about.
Right, regardless, I guess, of who they are or what they do, just they appeal to you for some reason or not? Yeah. Well, what do the rest of you do? Is there a process for finding guests that you...
Well, for our show, we really need the personal story. So we always say it has to have a character and an action and an intent. So it's a person doing something for a reason is what we look for. So we have big names, but we also have people that no one's ever heard of. And it's because their story's really compelling and it's something that our audience can perhaps relate to. So for us, we do a lot of research into our guests. We make sure that they have a compelling story, and sometimes it takes a while to get it out of them. So you have an artist doing some project, and then you interview them, and then you find this one nugget, like, this is what we're going with. This is what, you don't know that this is the most interesting thing about your story, but we'll make it that, because that's what people want to hear.
I think that goes the same for any kind of journalism, too. You're looking for the interesting angle that's going to pull in readers or viewers or listeners, yeah.
For sure. Yeah, and so it is a process, and then obviously we have to consider other things. Are they a good talker? Can they string a sentence together? But other than that, we're just trying to find a really strong story, and it can be anyone. I think some people don't even understand the power of their own personal story. They just kind of neglect it and say, well, my life is whatever. But everyone has a story to tell, and it's just figuring out the angle and how to tell it.
That's a good way to describe it, I think. I think regardless of genre or theme of a podcast, that is what everyone's looking for. Radio, podcasting, really anything, any way to tell someone's story. You want to find, what it is that makes them stand out.
For sure, yeah.
That's cool.
I think as a host, I've only been doing it for a year, but as a host, the more, like, artists have stories. Let's not lie. Like, we wouldn't be doing what we do if we didn't have stories, right? And as hosts, we have to sort of, like she said, extract them out of them, because sometimes you can have someone who's a bit of an introvert on the show, and then you make them the star for that half hour, that 45 minutes or whatever. And as soon as you hear something that, like a nugget, then you ask more, you probe into, how'd that make you feel? And for something that I do with my guests is I would ask people to come on, like, who are artists, but they would have to be, like, because I want to hear my voice and voices that aren't heard on the general radio, especially when it comes to queer voices. And I would get them on, and I would, ask them questions, and most of the time they are artists, and they have something to promote, and I just want to hear their story, how they got there, and what they're going to do. And
no, that's cool. I think of the panel here, my stories are always heard. Being a white guy, I think that, like, I'm the odd one out here. Do you think that it's very cool we have such a diverse panel too? Do you think that part of the reason behind any of you getting into podcasting was to get that voice heard? That wasn't maybe necessarily.
Sorry, Stefan. I had a web series called Style and Soul. And was that Roger 2015? 2015. And then I went to Washington for the Million Man March. And I was only there for a weekend, and that completely changed my life. Everything that I, or not everything, but a lot of the things that I, read on the internet, seen on YouTube was actually like right in my face. The stories that I heard that weekend was just incredible. And Roger was saying to me, let's do podcasts. And I was like, no. Came back from Washington and was like, yeah, let's do that. Let's make sure that this time around, that we are implementing conversations around social justice, making sure that we are highlighting BIPOC people, and really switching that narrative. That was one of the many, many inspirations behind Soul Unexpected, was changing that narrative, being able to share our stories, being able to show us in a light that isn't in the stereotypes, that we are musicians, we are creatives, we're, law students, we're therapists, we live normal lives like everybody else. So for my podcast, I try to have those conversations with my guests, those hard conversations, but keeping it about personal development. We persevere through, as Black and Indigenous people of color, we have to persevere through a lot of things, even if we are living successful lives. So I wanted to make sure to highlight those particular stories.
Yeah, so like the whole my own voice. See, like on my podcast, I tell stories like me and my cousin getting drunk and falling in a ditch. So like, these people are professional, and I'm just a guy with a recorder in a basement that just found some luck somewhere. So to answer your question, to hear my own voice, yes, I want to hear more idiots like me talk about stupid things. Yes, I do. And like, I come from mixed parents. My mom is Métis, my dad is First Nation. So when I don't hear kids who are mixed as often as I would like, being able to share a multi-biracial experience. Like Adeline talked about it, I've talked about it, and I've heard of a few. But going back to an earlier question when talking about the guests, I didn't throw my 2 cents in on that, but Roger, who's the guy holding the phone up back there, is actually one of the organizers of the Manitoba Podcast Fest as well. And
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Roger. So Roger, Sam, and myself are actually putting together the festival, and we did an episode together where it would be I interviewed him on my podcast, and I literally just asked him, like, Sam, you want to come down on Sunday? He's like, yeah, I'll be there on Sunday. And then from that, it grew into something like, we should do something together further than this, and then which led to the Manitoba Podcast Festival, which led to Creative Manitoba bringing us here for this. So from a small, tiny, Sam, what are you doing on Sunday?
Yeah, I was just some random guy on the internet you contacted because you'd heard my show, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now there's 50 people in a room and we're being streamed on the internet.
And they actually care what we have to say.
Exactly. So to find a guest, and maybe on a bigger scale, one morning I was at school, I was going to school, and Roger said, hey, Reggie Leach is in town. He's an NHL player from the 70s who won a Stanley Cup. And he was in town, and Roger said, if I can get Reggie Leach here, will you leave school and come do an interview? And I said, yeah. He messaged me at like 9 a.m. He's like, messaged me 10 minutes later. He's going to be here at 10. So I drove across the city from school. I got there. I did an hour-long interview, and a funny story, we hit the record button, but we turned on the wrong mic, and his wasn't recording. So we podcasting rookie error, anybody. Make sure your mics are working. So when we did this, Roger stopped him in the middle of a really cool story about his mom, and Reggie Leach is sitting there with his Stanley Cup ring on his finger, clenching. His knuckles are white, and I'm thinking Roger's going to have a Philadelphia Flyers logo on his forehead. So instead, we just stopped, and Roger was like, hey, sorry, can we just restart? So we did, and he was totally cool about it, but from a small little text at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning to, Sam, what are you doing on Sunday, to this room being filled, to September 30th, the Manitoba Podcast Festival, I think people overlook the fact that it's the small little things that matter. It's not I need to book the MTS Center for a big event. That doesn't happen so smoothly. It's just, again, the point. Sam, what are you doing on Sunday? Let's get together.
Yeah.
From that, little things, eventually everybody's here.
Well, and the fact that you got Reggie Leach, I'm still jealous that you did that, by the way. But the fact that, yeah, Roger should be here. Everyone keeps talking about him. But the fact that you got Reggie Leach, though, that opens you up to a whole bunch of people who may not have heard your show before, but they know him and they want to check out the podcast for that reason. I did the same thing. I had Fred Penner on my show, and the exact same thing happened. I went down to UMFM to record it in their studio so I wouldn't screw it up. But then they screwed it up, and my microphone was not picking up at all. So I got the recording of Fred talking and singing and everything, and you can barely hear me. But it worked. I fixed it. But yeah, like that, and that show turned on a lot of other people to my podcast who maybe would never have heard whatever punk band I interviewed the week before, but they know Fred Penner, and then they look at the archives, and there might be some other music they're interested in, and then it benefits not only me getting new listeners, but also the artists who have been on the show, because having that one big name draws people from all over. I mean, like you were saying, people from countries you probably never would even thought.
Are listening.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess just to stick on the guests for a minute, what do you think is the best? Like, how do you? I know we sort of touched on how you find your guests, but do you find that you've reached a point where the guests are coming to you and you have to sort of filter who is? I don't want to say worth being on the show because everyone has a story, but who is kind of the ideal person you want to talk to?
No.
That hasn't happened?
No. Well, to a point, yes. But like we were talking about the imposter syndrome of like, am I worthy? Do I belong? People think that podcasting is like a realm above them in some cases. So they don't, in my case, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but they don't approach me as much as I thought they would.
Well, what about the rest of you? Are you having, yeah?
No, I get people coming to ask, and I'm on a bit of a break right now, just got a new job, whatever, and people are coming to me when they see me. I don't want to be like I'm a living brand, but like when I go out into gay communities and this and that, I do mention I do a show, and when they, oh, you do a show, let's get our voices out there. And back to the question about wanting your voice out there is, like I'm a gay Muslim, and there's nothing in the media other than that negativity. And then my motivation to do my podcast was after the Pulse shootings, and then like a Muslim guy is killing gays, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm intersectionality dream, right? No, it was a nightmare. And so I decided to put my voice out there, and then sure enough, gay Muslims around the world are listening, and when I tell people I do a show, they're really interested in wanting to get their stories out there, which is inspiring to me because they've one of the biggest themes in my show is which I noticed after listening to a few is what does it feel like to be unnoticed, and these are what the stories that we get, and yeah.
I think your show is a great example of a show that where you've had a guest on that really can open doors to people who are not in your core audience. Because I had heard of your show, but I thought I'm not in the gay community. I don't know if this is gonna be relevant to me. I have so many other podcasts I'm listening to. I'm gonna leave this till some other time. But then I saw you had Sulin from Propaganda on your show, and I host a music show. I'm interested in hearing musicians. And
wasn't that a great show?
It was a great episode.
Yeah, really good. I was surprised.
So that basically opened the door for me to listen to a show that maybe I wouldn't have thought was relevant to me, right? But and just having the right guests can do that. I think it can open it to a much wider audience. But yeah, that's. Did you look like you had something to say about the?
Well, I was just going to say, well, CBC, we get a lot of pitches constantly, press releases, but I would say even on our show, which has some, I guess, attention nationally, most of our interviews, I would say over 50% of our interviews is us chasing them.
Okay.
So we still get approached by people, and I think having a name, it's easier to get into the door, but at the same time, because we're looking for the strong personal story. We're looking for the storytellers. It's not often obvious, and sometimes the bigger names don't really work. Sometimes the press releases outlining an artist's work doesn't really work for our show. So we need something a bit more meat to it. Okay. So I'd say mostly we're doing the chasing ourselves and not being approached.
Does being with CBC in any way prevent you from finding some of the stories? I mean, because the podcast is such a Wild West sort of thing right now, where you can, a lot of people's podcasts, you can say literally anything you want and get away with it, right? But I mean, obviously with CBC, you have standards and regulations. Like, has that ever come into effect where if you were doing your own podcast separate from the CBC, you could have maybe pursued something different?
I would say the big thing for our show is because we are an Indigenous show, we do deal with a lot of hot political topics, and it's very hard to find a balance because we do typically, because we still fall under journalistic standards, we have to find a balance. So it's sometimes difficult for us to figure out how to have an activist on our show, even though we want to, even though it makes sense for our show because this is what everyone is talking about in the community. It kind of makes it hard. So we have to figure out a way. We usually do, but I'd say it doesn't really prevent us, but we just have to figure out a different angle of how to approach it. So we can't have somebody going on the radio talking about their political views and
right, potentially offending the entire listenership.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out a way around it, but there's always a way.
Well, the journalistic element of it is interesting because I think a lot of podcasters and people who want to do interview shows are under the impression that they need to have a journalistic background. I worked as a print reporter for a long time, and I'm going back into journalism in a couple weeks as a career. But I think a lot of people just they have no background whatsoever, and I think it's maybe often seen as a barrier to entry because how do you interview someone? What equipment do you use? How do you know how to find someone to be on your show? Like for the rest of you who aren't the CBC or maybe don't have the same backgrounds, like how did you have any struggles at the beginning on sort of figuring out how to do this, how to actually ask questions and interview guests?
Oh, 100%. I started from the ground up. I started from zero. I was just inspired just to get my voice out there. And, like you were talking about finding the right equipment. And you just have to, if you want to do it, just do it. There's nothing really stopping you. All the technology is out there. And getting your podcast actually online is free. So that doesn't cost you anything. And if you record off your phone, that's another thing. But if you want a good quality sound, just go out and buy equipment, rent equipment, borrow equipment, and get yourself out there. I wanted to invest in myself a little bit, so I got better equipment and paid for a website domain. But other than that, it's free. So it's accessible to anybody to put out there.
I think that's all like real, but also one thing that no, that's real. But one thing I struggled with is the imposter syndrome. Like, who do you think you are? You're not educated in this. You don't know what you're doing. There's so many times where I was like, yeah, you want to have your voice heard, but what if people, this, all the things that we think as humans, what are people going to think? What are people going to say? What if people come for me, which they do anyways? And, having to work through those things has been one of the probably the best things for me, because I had to really own who I am, own what it is that the message that I want to put out into the world, and I wrote a book called Be Unapologetically You, and be exactly that. Be unapologetic about the work that you are doing. So that's one thing that I struggled with is, am I even worthy of doing this? Who do you think you are, Adeline? Like, all of that. And that's something that through podcasting you have the opportunity to do.
Did your book come about after you'd been doing the podcast for a while, or was that before?
Actually, yes. I wrote Be Unapologetically You because of, and I talk about this in the book, because of all the stuff that I was seeing on social media. There in 2000, probably 14, 15, 16 until now, constantly going on my social media, seeing another black man being shot or black woman being shot, another missing and murdered Indigenous man or woman, child. Like, it was I was constantly being bombarded with this negativity. And so I thought, well, what is the one thing that has saved my life? And that was self-love. So in my book, I share ways to, love yourself, the things I've gone through, questions I've asked myself. So, yeah.
And do you think you ever would have done that book if you hadn't done the podcast first?
Oh, no. No, because like I said, it takes a lot of confidence. It takes a lot of confidence to share your story, to share your narrative, and being an Afro-Indigenous woman, this world tells me a lot of things about who I am that aren't too nice. So if, and I grew up thinking those things and believing those things. So I really, my mission, I always tell people I do this for the generation coming behind me. I mean that. I want BIPOC kids, all youth to own their voice and be unapologetic about it.
Cool. So I like how you threw the name of the book. Very good. And you could probably buy it if you want.
Yes, available now.
Yeah. So I think everyone here has kind of been involved in this hobby or business or whatever you want to call it for different amounts of time. But have you seen, this is a question for anyone on the panel here, have you seen the community locally in terms of just maybe the number of podcasts or the variety of podcasts coming out of Winnipeg? Have you seen it grow over the time you've been doing this? Have you seen kind of more interest from people in general in creating their own podcasts?
Yeah, and what I think of is before I discovered podcasts, I would listen to, I don't know if they still have it, but on iTunes, they had iTunes U, and it was a series of lectures from different universities. So I'd pick
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, so I would listen to those, and I would listen to a lecture from Duke University about African American studies or whatever it is, just to learn a little bit. And then I discovered what podcasting was. This is probably like maybe 2006, 7, 8-ish. And like I had that imposter syndrome, and I was still wrestling. I was wrestling in Winnipeg, and I was wrestling in other provinces in U.S., and I eventually went to Japan. And then when I stopped wrestling and I had no creative outlet, I knew that Garbage Hill, the Garbage Hill Podcast Network, was a big thing. Yeah. And they had a whole umbrella of shows that they would present, all in different kind of like unique takes. Like your show was on there. Yeah. What was Devin's show called? Couch Surfing, where it was just two dudes on a couch just hanging out with somebody. And I would listen to these things like Red River Ransom and whatnot. And I listened to these things and I thought, like that imposter syndrome, like, oh, who am I? You know, like these guys have their shit together. They know what they're doing. Can I swear?
Well, you just did, so I think it doesn't matter at this point.
I don't know. I work in radio, so I can like push the delay button and just slow things down. But
everyone in that group of people you're talking about, like none of us had our shit together. You know?
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's what people think is like, you know, everybody's got their shit together and they've got a brand and they got a machine behind them, but they really don't. No. And when I started mine, what was the question again? Have I seen it grow? Yes, I have seen it grow from Garbage Hill to Garbage Hill. Eventually, I don't want to say going away, but really going away, and then only being a couple shows left. And then me, Adeline, and Roger started our podcast. I think me and Adeline started, I think, the same week maybe. And then Roger started his maybe a month later. And then the three of us turned into, you know, a community with you, and then growing with someone else, and then finding out that there's other podcasts that have started, like, what are some of the ones you listen to, like Paper Cut?
Paper Cut's really good, yeah. There's a bunch of true crime ones that started in Winnipeg. Pub Chat's great, yeah.
Exactly. So you see all these Winnipeg podcasts, and, you know, it went from Garbage Hill, and then it kind of went down, and now it's coming back up again.
Yeah, that's, I kind of feel the same way.
I never knew that.
Well, what was your, I guess, experience with local podcasts? Did you know
I never even had one, and just us three. I never until I came across you, and then until I met Cameron. So I didn't even know that there was a local podcast movement happening here.
Did you think you were just kind of in a void, the three of you?
I thought we were onto something new.
And for me, I'm just brand new into this, so I woke up to my podcast. I'm like, there's so many in Winnipeg.
Yeah, there's so many now.
Yeah. Anyway.
So obviously, I mean, some of the stuff we're talking about, people are finding ways to do it on their own. You know, whether it's just picking up a microphone and going, or trying to, you know, renting equipment like you were saying, and getting more professional about it. But there seems to be a lot more interest anyway right now. And look at the size of the room here, in people just wanting to know about podcasts and about podcasting. And I think that's great. I mean, a lot of the shows I've heard in Winnipeg, some of them I love, some of them I could care less for, but that doesn't matter, right? Because it's like, it's not all for me. And like we're all talking here, everyone here has a very distinct audience and a very kind of niche subject matter. And a lot of that isn't going to apply to me or isn't going to apply to you or you. And so it's cool to see. I'm very happy to see any podcast, whatever the topic is. And I had a follow-up question, but you can.
Yeah, I got a follow-up question for you. This is me podcasting taking over. So CBC, what's CBC's feel on the ground level of like podcasts like the three of us and Sam and Roger and the rest of, maybe there are other podcasters here?
Oh, that's a lot of pressure.
What, do you mean like are we encroaching on their territory? Or?
Just so people who are listening to the Facebook stream, maybe more so like the CBC have an understanding that there's like this whole underneath bed of like do-it-yourself podcasts, and possibly do they see it as a resource or as like a detriment?
I think they're definitely open for it now. They're starting a Creator Network, I believe is what it's called. And there is somebody here working for that. It's more YouTube and short series on YouTube. But they are interested in creating content in a different way that's consumed online primarily. So yeah, I think that they're very open. And honestly, the door is always open to pitching podcasts. I know it seems kind of daunting, but there is a pitch page on CBC. I have no idea where to find it, but it's somewhere on there, and you're able to pitch a podcast idea if you have one. Yeah, and so it's definitely open to anyone, and I think some ways that CBC have found people is kind of surprising. So I'd say definitely if you have something that you want to pitch to them, go for it.
Actually, if you can find it, put it out somewhere. No, because I tried to click on it and it's a dead link.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
oh.
so let me know.
Yeah.
Let me know.
I'll figure it out.
Everyone was talking about the imposter syndrome earlier. I've actually been to that pitch page a few times over the years and wanted to click it, but then, no one wants to hear what I have to talk about. So I think there might be, especially for people who are doing it DIY, like the Basement type podcast, there might be a bit of a barrier thinking, oh, well, this is a professional journalistic endeavor. I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can break through to that. So, like, what would be your advice, I guess, for someone who has a really good idea and maybe not the experience or the technical training?
I'd say just trust in your abilities. If you've been doing podcasting by yourself, then you definitely have skills that are applicable to a radio show. It's not really any different. It's just the ability to edit audio. If you have figured out how to mix different audio clips, then you're good to go. So I think it's just a matter of applying for things. There are lots of entry-level positions at CBC, and especially the Bureau here, they're very open to getting people who come from the community and training them and getting them going, which has happened quite a bit. I was brought on as an intern. I used to work for a small organization called Journalists for Human Rights, and I lived in a small reserve in Northern Ontario, and I just applied for this internship and I got in. That's how I got in. So I think that it's definitely open to people, and just trust your skills, because you'd be surprised at how, if you hear the origin story about how a lot of people got started, I'd say a huge chunk of CBCers are not trained in journalism. They come from a background in knowledge on their community, and that's why they were hired. So there's a lot of different reasons why people will be hired by the CBC, and it's not just having the skills and not just having the education, because again, I'm a rarity. I do have a journalism degree, but most of my colleagues do not. So
Well, yeah, and that's what my experience has been with podcasts too. I mean, I went to journalism school as well, and most people I know who are doing shows, they have none of that, and some of their shows are much better than mine. So
for sure.
you don't need it, right? It's not essential. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
Yeah,
so.
for sure.
For sure.
I think maybe a good thing to talk about now would be we've mentioned it a few times, but the Manitoba Podcast Festival. Part of the reason, like we said, Stefan and Roger back there again, and I sort of organized it in the first place is because we want people to come out and learn how to do this. I think kind of a common feeling from everyone here has been like that we encourage people, everyone sort of who does this wants to see other people doing it and wants to see other people taking the chance and the opportunity to make their voice heard, whatever it is. If they want to do a podcast about, some obscure horror movie and every episode, go ahead. If you want to do a podcast about, anything, right? So the reason we kind of started the festival is because we noticed a community growing here, and we want people to show up and ask questions. We're having 3 or 4 panel discussions very similar to this at the Park Theater, and the idea is for people to come out and talk to us. We'll talk amongst ourselves, I guess, but come out and kind of give their opinions and their questions of how they can get started. And none of us, are necessarily experts, but we've just been doing it, and for whatever reason, people have listened. we've generated an audience. So I don't know if you want to say anything about this, Stefan, but.
About the podcast festival specifically?
Yeah.
So,
or I guess the reasons why you think it's important that we're doing this.
Right. So I think one of the important things is getting people together and networking just like we are today. Simply because, like we've referenced a few times, me, Adeline, and Roger, Adeline didn't even know there was other podcasts around. So the fact that this is happening and, we're putting together the festival is really important. And I think I don't want people to get the wrong idea that it's just going to be like a series of shows and like each show is going to have an hour and you can come and watch and interact. That's part of it because our plan is to record each panel and then eventually release it so it's kind of like an online resource for people. But the afternoon is going to be much like this. There's going to be panel, networking, Q&A, and possibly a free lunch.
I don't know. Did we figure that out yet?
I don't know. We got a couple weeks.
Pretend you didn't hear about the free lunch.
Edit that out, right?
Yeah. But no, seriously, yeah. The idea is that we want people to come up and whether they want to ask questions while the panel's happening in front of everyone, or come before or come afterwards and approach one of us. And I want to see more people doing this. I love listening to podcasts. And my list of podcasts I've subscribed to continues to grow, and a lot more local shows have been kind of added over the years, right? So
yeah.
I'm always happy to hear what people are doing because it's fun, it's easy. There really isn't that much of a barrier to entry. You need to get a recording device, whether it could even be your phone, like you said, Cameron, right? And you go, and you got a podcast. So
the podcast festival is, I think the really important part is bringing in, I don't want to use like a corny term or anything like that, but bringing in the next generation, because actually, on Monday, my podcast, the Ever Sick podcast that I do, is ending. I've recorded my last episode. I've said my goodbyes and thanked the sponsors and everything, but it's over. And that being not because like I think I'm too good or anything, but I don't want to spread myself too thin, because I'm lucky enough to have made this my career, in a sense that I don't want to spread myself too thin and cheat the listener and miss an episode, because mine has come out every Monday minus like a few like assigned breaks since 2015 in October, and I don't want to start missing episodes and then start putting out one a month and then have it be 20 minutes and have it suck. I don't want that. I want to cheat my listener, so I'm leaving before it starts to fall off. And even maybe not anybody that listens to my show. I don't know if anybody listens here, but I feel like it's already started to kind of fade away just a little bit, and I don't want that. And I don't want people to think, oh, it was good, and then that happened. So I think the podcast festival is very important to have somebody else come, and let's say you wanted to start a show and you wanted to start about X, Y, and Z. Now I have something to listen to. Now that I'm kind of out of the game, per se, the next person can come and take over, not necessarily my spot or anything, but just like have another resource in the community. And I think that's what's lacking, because for the 100th time, Roger in the back there is in charge of the Indigenous Filmmaker Collective, which is essentially this, but with filmmakers. So they get together once a month, sometimes twice a month, and they have a potluck, or else they'll sit around and they'll talk. They'll dip into each other's resources, like they'll have actors, filmmakers, producers, costume designers, and they'll all get together and then pick each other. It's like, hey, I got a shoot coming up 2 weeks from now. Are you free? And that's how it happens. And podcasting is very much the same way. It's a network of people that needs to grow in this city, and I think that would be very important.
And I think as someone who hosts a music show, this is my frame of reference, but I feel like podcasting in Winnipeg, the way I'm seeing things like this come together, and things like the festival and all the networking and friends and colleagues everyone's making, it reminds me of the DIY punk scene, because almost everything is DIY. People are doing it in basements, they're recording on whatever they have, and there's like a sense of community that I got growing up being into punk rock that I'm also getting now, in my late 30s from podcasts. Mm-hmm. So it's cool. It's a cool parallel. I kind of like that.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say I got my start in interest in radio and audio in general through community radio. So I think it's a resource that a lot of people overlook.
For sure.
Yeah. I had a radio show in Victoria for 3 years, a music show, and that's how I got into it. And then it expanded into news, and then from there I became more interested in storytelling. So I think even if somebody is curious in podcasting, but they don't have an idea for a show, because it is kind of daunting. Because I think the more successful shows have quite the focus. So if you don't know what you want to do, but you're curious to learn the skills, or you're curious to even get your hands on audio and playing with it, then go to your local community radio station and start there. It's as simple as that. And they provide all the training that's very much applicable to producing a podcast.
That's a very timely thing to bring up, because actually at the podcast festival, one of the panels we're doing is podcasting versus radio. So we're having professionals from local radio stations and local podcasts, and kind of talking about the finer points of each, and what might be beneficial to one person in a podcast form might actually be better for someone else doing it in more of a structured radio form. So I think there's it's very connected, especially the DIY element of it, and there's a lot.
For sure. Yeah.
There's also another, you can actually do video on podcasts as well. So there's podcasting is not just audio. It is visual as well. So if you are, let's say, an artist who may have, I don't know, music or art or whatever it may be, you can still showcase it on your podcast through the video aspect. So there's so many different ways to just share your work and to do this. It's not just audio. It's not just getting a recorder. You can even just do it off your phone. There's so many cool and interesting ways to podcast.
For sure, and video podcasting, I think, is almost a whole different genre. I mean, we can't. It's not enough time to talk about it here, but it's its own thing. And yeah, like you said, the convenience of it. And you have probably a recording device in your pocket right now that you could just turn on and talk and post it for free online and say what you want to say. And maybe you'll get listeners. Maybe you have to tweak it a bit. But yeah, I think that with the size of the room here, hopefully people have questions. So yeah, let's. Should we? I'll pass this mic around. Okay, so here we go.
What I was hoping you might address tonight is, like, I have a blog, and it's a very active blog, and I wanted to add a podcast as a component to the blog, and I wasn't quite sure how to go about doing that. Is it just a matter of recording something, putting it on YouTube, and linking to having that link to your blog, or can someone help us with that?
Okay, so you have a blog, which means you have a website, right? So if you what type of website? Okay, we'll get into the technicals later. Okay, yeah. So you have a website, right? And then you want to load the audio. Just film the record the audio in any type of way. Put the audio onto the website, and it becomes an RSS feed. You take that feed and you can put it onto Google Play, Apple Podcasts.
Spotify, iTunes,
yeah,
everything. Yeah.
So on all these platforms, you can put it on, and it is pretty simple. But if you do want to know, I mean, we can connect, and I can help you out with that. But once you do one, easy. Yeah.
And the best part about the feed there, like he's talking about, is that people can subscribe to your show. So whether people don't have to go to your blog every week to find the new episode, it'll just automatically download to their phone or whatever they're listening on. So you kind of have a built-in audience as soon as people start subscribing. So does anyone else have questions? Let's see if this reaches.
Thank you. This is for the CBC gal. When I heard that CBC Radio was going to start doing podcasts, I'm going, well, they're into radio. They're not into podcasts. Like, doesn't that break apart the audience, fraction it, and like, what do they really gain? Is it like, are they really gaining something, or are they losing something?
Well, I think like I said, a lot of the podcasts are eventually played on radio at some point. But we're trying to diversify as much as possible to reach an audience that we realize that there's a demographic that we haven't hit, and it's a younger demographic, and they're getting their content online. They're not turning on the radio. They're not watching TV anymore. So it's just a way of reaching a different audience. But at the same time, it has a different sound, a podcast, than a radio show. It allows us to be a bit more creative because it doesn't really fall under journalistic rules a lot of the time. So you're able to kind of break away from the standard news telling. So it like, I understand what you're saying. It possibly is excluding an audience, but hopefully by showing them how to get into podcasting, which we have videos online available to explain how to find a podcast, then hopefully we'll invite more people into that realm as well. Yeah.
Any other questions?
So I know CBC is more of an established brand, and I know, Cameron, you were talking about using Google AdWords, but for everyone else, how do you go about marketing your shows?
Social media, mostly social media. It's one of the best tools so far that I've used. I eventually, probably next season, want to look at getting some sponsors on the show. But yeah, I think it's growing first, right? It's like getting people to listen, to grow your audience, and yeah.
In my case, I talked about my lack of professionalism and structure. I didn't market it at all. It was just word of mouth. And like, I'm not saying that I didn't care, but I really didn't care if people listened. I didn't. I just wanted a place where me and my cousins and my friends, and in a case like I had a chance with Reggie Leach, just to talk to them and just to pick their brain. That's really all I wanted. And then eventually I actually did Adeline's podcast. I think I've told her this before, but she asked me, she's like, well, what are you going to do with this? And I was like, sorry, I'll swear this, because I'll quote myself. I was like, fucking nothing, man. Like, I ain't doing nothing. And then eventually she's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you putting out all this content for free and not expecting anything back? And then eventually something clicked, and then everything started moving very, very fast. And that was like within the last year. So
I just want to kind of echo what Adeline said about social media. I interview musicians, like I said, and a lot of the time I'll have maybe 3 or 4 members of a band on. So I just kind of ask them at the end of the show, can you share this on whatever platforms you use? And so in that case, I get the band's official page sharing it on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and then each individual member will do that as well. And it just kind of, it's word of mouth, but you get an extra boost because all of these people, or even if it's just one person, are sharing it with their audience as well.
I think with me, from the marketing stance, is I'm very niche, like marginalized queer communities, and I started to talk to people and find where your people and your tribe actually collect and move, and then go talk to them. So I talked to different pride organizations in Canada, and I talked to basically that. I talked to Pride Canada, and I talked to QPOC in Winnipeg, and just let them know that, hey, I exist. Tell your people about me, this and that, and social media helps a lot too. Yeah, speaking engagements, as many as possible.
The community radio came up a couple of times. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you meant by getting started with community radio.
Honestly, it's just going through the front door and saying I want to get involved. I volunteered at 2 different community radio stations, one in Victoria, one in Montreal. And it's just a matter of going in and saying I want to get involved, and they usually start you out with doing things like I had to sort CDs for the first month that I was at the one in Victoria, and then eventually you can get into training, and they will show you how to put together a show. They'll show you how to work the board, and then from there you can learn other things like how to cut tape before you air it, and it's not actually cutting tape. It used to be,
not anymore,
but not anymore. Yeah. So I think it's just a matter of emailing. There's usually, if you go to any university, it's usually universities. So if you go to a university's website, you can find what their community radio station is. Sorry, I do not know the ones here.
No, I was just going to actually,
from Winnipeg.
One of the Winnipeg stations here actually airs my show. I didn't approach them. I was always a listener, but they asked me, the station manager, if he could start airing my show at some ridiculous, late night hour. And so I was really happy to do that, because it's kind of a great way to get people listening. And the fact that you're actually on the FM dial kind of lends some credibility to what you're doing. If someone's never heard of a podcast before and you say, oh, well, it airs at 3 a.m. on this channel, right? Then at least they can kind of connect. But the stations here in Winnipeg, my show gets aired on one of them, and I've interacted with people from the other, and they're so helpful. Like, they are really, really encouraging for local people from any background, whatever kind of music or content they want to share. They want you to do it, right? So they're UMFM and CKUW are the 2 here, and they're both 101.5 and 95.9 FM, and the volunteers there are awesome. The permanent employees there are fantastic. Like, everyone just really wants to hear more voices in the community. So I would really encourage you, if you want to do a show, to check them out.
Also, CJNU, they air the Winnipeg Gold Eyes, the 93.7. They are very involved in, I know for a fact, I'm not sure about Red Rivers, Creecom, or anything like that, but they are involved with places like Herzing College and high school radio students. They'll just like, hey, if you want, come down on a Sunday for an hour. You can board up, which means just turn the mic on and off, turn the volume up and down, things like that. They're very helpful.
I just wanted to ask the panel, what is the most challenging thing about starting a podcast? And the second part is that, do you have to edit one person can just pick your phone up and start doing podcasts, or you have to know how to edit, some kind of technical knowledge?
As far as the editing thing, I do very minimal editing. I record an intro to say what the episode's about. I record the episode, and then I record an outro saying thanks for listening, whatever. And you can find this person on social media. That's very minimal editing, but there are people who will literally just turn the mic on, record an hour, and then just put it out, nothing, just raw. But to start a podcast, my biggest advice is to actually start it. Because people are in that mindset where like, oh, I don't know, should I do it? What will I talk about? Just start it. Just start talking. My first episode was 6 minutes long, and I had talked about how I wanted Click. You know, guys know what Click is? That spam. I wanted Click to sponsor my podcast. I talked for 6 minutes about that.
Is that still available online?
It's somewhere.
My first one was 3 hours long, and it was terrible, unlistenable. But yeah, like I mean, yeah, it was long. It was. We didn't realize at the time. I was doing it with a couple of friends. It was the first attempt at podcasting, and we didn't realize until afterwards how unnecessarily long it had been. But yeah, like I agree with that for sure. You should just start it. I mean, if you're not sure how to edit, don't edit. Just record it, post it, and get advice from people. You know, find someone you know and let them listen. See what they have to say. They might love it as it is, and then you might learn editing kind of as you go.
And there's a lot of free programs available online for editing as well, and a lot of them are kind of intuitive, I would say. Not totally, but a little bit intuitive. Just a matter of Googling how to do certain things. That's how I learned.
We'll just have time for one more question.
One thing I wanted to mention that when I tried to start a podcast about a year ago, I discovered that, and I thought this would work, you can apparently do it on Wi-Fi. I guess it's not fast enough, even though it was just audio was broadcasting. So the lady in London, England, where my podcast came from, called Central Peg Life, said you must have a high-speed connection at home, because I thought wherever the internet was, you could go to a baseball park or Bomber Stadium and do a podcasting on the fly or on the street somewhere. But I discovered that, and she mentioned to me that you seem to have to have a high-speed connection, even if it's audio. I was surprised that audio is not video, right? It's just audio. So I was kind of surprised at that you needed a home connection with high speed to do a proper podcast if you're doing it live.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with live podcasting.
I don't use an internet connection to record anything. I'll just record on a recorder or a phone or whatever I have. But like in terms of uploading, if that's what you're asking about, or if maybe doing it live, like a Skype call or something, maybe.
It sounds like he was talking about live streaming it, right? Are you talking about just recording it and putting it out there as you? Okay.
I'm sure there's somebody who can help you technically with that.
Yeah, I think in most people's cases here, we record our shows beforehand and then release them afterwards. Like I do mine sometimes 3 or 4 weeks in advance or more, and so it's kind of in the bag. I have time to edit it and do what I need to do with it, and then I release it. If it's a band with a CD release coming out, I release that pre-recorded episode in time for that. So I think if you're having troubles with live streaming, that might be a solution, to just pre-record it and then release it, from home or somewhere you do have a fast connection. Is that? Cool. All right. Well, thanks for the panel for coming. This was really interesting. I mean, even though I know who some of you are and I've heard your shows, it's still interesting to kind of get more information. And it's awesome that so many people came too. Yeah, this is super cool. Thanks a lot.